Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a multi-award-winning British-Turkish novelist and the most widely read female author in Turkey. Her work's been translated into 57 languages, possibly even more now. She's written 20 books, 13 of which are novels, including The Bastard of Istanbul, The 40 Rules of Love, 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in This Strange World, and her 2021 novel, The Island of Missing Trees. She's been nominated for the Booker Prize, the Costa Award, the British Book Awards, and the Women's Prize of Fiction, and many more in between. She returns to the show she's been on many times before to talk about her latest novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky. It follows 3 lives spanning centuries and continents connected through a single drop of water, and 2 great rivers, the Tigris and the Thames. Elif Shafak, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you so much.
It's lovely to have you back in the studio, and we know that, of course, listeners can listen to some of your other interviews you've done here. But for those who haven't yet done that, maybe you could just give us a little brief biography, because such an interesting life, really brought up in a very female household.
Well, it's wonderful to be here to join you. Yes, I was brought up in a very matriarchal family household, I should say. I was born in France, in Strasbourg, and shortly afterwards my parents got separated, and my father stayed in France, and my mother brought me to Turkey, to Ankara, because for her it was motherland. For me it was a new country altogether. And we came to my grandmother's house, which was in a very conservative, very patriarchal and inward-looking neighbourhood. And in so many ways I think I felt like we did not quite fit in. At the time, my mom, because she had dropped out of university and now she was a young divorcee, she had no diploma, no career, no money, nothing to rely on. And women in such positions are usually immediately married off to someone older. But it was my grandmother who intervened, and she said, no, I'll take care of my grandchild until the day her mother is ready. Her mother should go back to university. And this is what they did, these 2 women. And I've never forgotten that. My grandma was not a well-educated person because she had been pulled out of school herself for being a girl, and she wholeheartedly and passionately believed in women's education and independence. So I've never forgotten this, because her support, that kind of sisterhood, changed my mother's life, and it changed my life and my children's. When women support each other, I think the impact of that goes beyond generations.
No, absolutely. And as you say, I mean, here you are, you've taught in universities now, and your children are highly educated, and it's really had a huge impact. And it's very sad when you look at Turkey and the direction in which it's moving now, which I don't think prioritises education for women any longer.
Unfortunately, not at all. I wish I could tell you it was otherwise, but actually I think we've been sliding backwards, going backwards in so many ways. This is not a coincidence. Whenever in the world democracy is bruised and broken, and democratic institutions and norms are undermined, and there's an erosion, I think the very first rights that will be taken away will be women's rights and minority rights. And this is what's happening in Turkey. It is so sad that Turkey has withdrawn now, the government, of course, has withdrawn unilaterally, all of a sudden, from Istanbul Convention, a convention that carries the name of Istanbul. And this is a progressive convention, that agreement, international treaty, that is designed to protect women who are suffering from domestic violence, gender violence, and also minorities as well, LGBTQ plus minorities as well. So instead of doing something about this acute crisis of gender violence and femicides in Turkey, it's very sad that the government is going in the exact opposite direction.
Did you set out to be a political writer?
You know, am I a political writer? I think I only see myself as a storyteller. That's it, without any adjectives. But that said, if you come from a country like Turkey, and if you happen to be a novelist, you do not have the luxury of being apolitical or non-political, Also, I am a feminist. I've learned many things from past generations of women's movement. And of course, one of the crucial things that feminist theory and practice has rightly so emphasizing is that politics is not only about what Rishi Sunak said or what happened in the parliament the day before. politics is present in all aspects of our lives, especially wherever there's an imbalance of power and, there's no equality. So in that sense, the personal is also political. You might write about sexuality, you might write about gender, family, divorce, marriage, such themes. You can still be a very political writer. The novel as an art form has politics within.
Mm-hmm. When you started writing, you started in Turkish.
I did indeed, and actually, as you can hear in my accent, I am not a native speaker. English for me is an acquired language. It is my third language, actually. I started learning around the time I was 10, 11 years old. Before that, there was Spanish. And my first novels were all written in Turkish. Of course, it's easier for me to write in Turkish. It would have been easier. But about 16, 17 years ago now, I switched. And ever since then, I've been writing in English first. And the reason why I do this, there are multiple reasons. I love the English language. I love Turkish as well. I feel connected to each language in a different way. My connection with Turkish is very emotional. My connection with the English language is perhaps a bit more cerebral. And I need both. But primarily, I need freedom of speech. To be a writer in Turkey is a heavy thing. To be a female novelist is even heavier. Writing in English gives me a cognitive distance, perhaps a layer of lightness and a zone of freedom, and I really, really cherish that.
And of course, you first came up against political problems with your novel, The Bastard of Istanbul. What happened with that?
So this is a novel that tells the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family through the eyes of women, generations of women, grandmothers, mothers, granddaughters. And it talks about the silences in our shared history, including the biggest taboo in Turkey to this day, which is the Armenian genocide. It's something we never ever talk about. So the book opens up conversations. When the novel came out, it was put on trial. I was put on trial for insulting Turkishness, even though nobody quite knows what that means. We have this article in the Turkish constitution that protects Turkishness against insults. And what followed was quite surreal and unsettling because for over a year I was put on trial. There were groups on the streets, like nationalist crowds, burning EU flags, spitting at my pictures, calling me a traitor. I was acquitted. And in a very surreal way, with me, the fictional characters were acquitted because the words of fictional characters were taken out of the book and used as evidence in the courtroom, as a result of which my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters. So we were all acquitted in the end.
Yeah, but that wasn't the end of it, because then you were, I think it was about 3 years later, you were investigated for crimes of obscenity.
Right. Indeed. Yes, this time, again, I wish I could say we've been going at least forwards in Turkey, making some progress in terms of democracy and freedom of speech, but it's quite the opposite. This time, police officers came to my Turkish publishing house. They took copies of two of my novels, and the prosecutor has been investigating my work for, quote-unquote, the crime of obscenity. What they mean by that is I write about difficult issues, including gender violence, child brides, and prostitution, all of which is a reality. So the irony, I guess, is instead of doing something about all these problems, especially the increasing rate of violence against women and also the number of child brides, almost every 1 out of 3 marriages in Turkey involves an underage girl. We need to talk about these issues. We cannot pretend it's not happening. So instead of doing something about it, changing the laws, changing the system, creating a cultural awareness, opening shelters for victims of domestic violence, instead of doing all of that, the fact that the government prosecutes fiction writers is very tragic, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I wonder what you see as the power of literature within politics and the challenges, particularly for writers who are from countries who have limited freedom of speech.
It's really tough because, there's so many obstacles in front of freedom of speech. It's not only governments and authorities. With the age of social media, in a day, you can be lynched, you can be called a traitor, across media and social media, it's bots and trolls. I think any author coming from countries like Iran, Russia, they will know what I'm talking about. So it's not easy. But at the same time, I don't want to paint a completely negative picture, because The interesting thing is, in countries such as my motherland, Turkey, books are not personal items. If a reader enjoys a novel, they pass it on. They don't just put it back on the bookshelf. So they give it to their best friend. The best friend gives it to her aunt. The aunt shares it with her neighbor. On average, the same copy is read perhaps by 5 to 6, 7 people, underlining different sentences with different colored pens. And to me, that is incredibly precious, that word of mouth, that love. So I do also receive a lot of love from readers of all backgrounds. You know, whole families come to my book signings in different parts of Europe or beyond. So I cannot forget that. And I always feel very grateful for the love, the feedback that readers give me.
I wonder what your relationship with Turkey is now, given that really you don't go there, but you're still very widely read there.
I am, and I'm grateful for that. My Turkish publisher, my readers of very different age groups. And of course, I feel very connected to the culture, the people, women, youth, minorities. We should never make the mistake of thinking that the government and the people are exactly the same. Maybe the tragedy of, I don't want to say tragedy, but the paradox that we need to understand is the people are usually ahead of their governments. And this is not something that's covered perhaps across international media. But all I'm trying to say is Turkey is a very complex country. It's a beautiful country, beautiful culture. So, of course, emotionally, I feel very attached. But that said, the UK is my home. I have made a home in this country, in this language as well, in the English language. So I also feel a very strong sense of belonging here. And despite what politicians telling us, what they have been telling us in the last years with the rise of populism, I think we need to think of ourselves as citizens of humanity, citizens of the world, so we can have multiple belongings.
And of course, one thing that you really do for those of us who are not from Turkey is you have a platform to explain the culture, the politics, the whole feeling of Turkey. Every single one of your books that is set there, I suddenly feel, I've never been to Turkey, I'm transported. You give us this wonderful picture, but not just of the geography. You give us an insight into the people.
Well, I hope so. But at the same time, I really try to think beyond boxes of identity. The multiple belongings that I mentioned earlier, this is very crucial for me. I like to think of identity as something more fluid, more plural, like maybe ripples in water. Of course, where I come from is a big part of my writing, my sense of self. But at the same time, there are lots of other circles surrounding it. I feel very connected to Europe. I feel connected to the Balkans, Anatolia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. There are elements in my soul that come from the Middle East. But as I said, I consider myself British. I consider myself a citizen of the world. So lots of other circles of belonging are also important to me. And so I think in my books, there aren't only Turkish stories, but there are quite, if I may use this word, cosmopolitan encounters. What I love, and that's one of the many reasons why I love the novel as an art form so much, is because the multiplicity that we're denied in our daily life. We're always pushed into boxes. But inside literature, there's freedom. Inside literature, we can be multiple. And that is very, very precious. So the writer is alone when they're writing, the reader is alone when they're reading. But within that solitude, actually, we connect with the rest of humanity.
Now, just picking up what you're saying about ripples and water and multiplicity, your new book, which is There Are Rivers in the Sky, brings all of that together because it centres around a drop of water, but we are across different timelines, different geographical zones, different characters. Give us an outline of the book.
Yes, so There Are Rivers in the Sky is the story of 3 characters who seem to be completely different at first glance. They live in different parts of the world or historical eras. However, they are connected in a very, very surprising way. So it's 3 characters, 2 rivers, which are the River Thames and the River Tigris in the Middle East, and 1 ancient poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, 3, 2, 1. And everything in this book, which spans centuries, continents, and cultures, everything in this structure is connected via a tiny, small raindrop, which falls on the head of King Ashurbanipal thousands of years ago. It's for me, the whole novel is a love letter to, or a love poem to water. You know, water is the mystery, the biggest mystery in our lives. We take it for granted. When we talk about climate crisis, actually we're talking about freshwater crisis. If I may quickly add this, we need to connect the dots. We tend to think that water crisis is a separate issue than, for instance, gender violence. But actually they're so connected. Women all around the world are carriers of water, just like they're the carriers of memory. So they're the water bringers, right? When there's no water, they have to walk longer distances, increasing, unfortunately, the possibility for gender violence further. So things are connected, actually. And I want to emphasize that out of the 10 most water-stressed nations right now in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and North Africa. So the land where I come from is actually experiencing the water shortage in a very acute, dire way, and there are massive political, cultural and social consequences.
Women are the carriers of memory, but so is water.
I think so. I mean, that's why the book says water remembers, it's humans who forget. So if we were to follow the journey of even a tiny drop of water, we would have realized that actually we're far more connected as human beings than we realize. Our stories are connected, our destinies are connected. We tend to think that the East is a different thing, that the West is a different thing, that these are different boxes. We tend to think that the river Mississippi is very different than the river Euphrates, or the river Thames is very different than the river Tigris. At least the surrounding cultures are completely different cultures. But then when you pay attention to it, actually it's the same water that's traveling through these riverbeds, and it's the same water, or the tears that we shed when we're sad. It's the same water that we've been drinking for centuries. So everything is interlinked.
Tell us about the main characters in the book.
So one of the main characters is called King Arthur of the sewers and slums. And it might sound strange for an author to say this, but I love him so much.
You know, his whole, the way he comes to be named is very funny.
It is.
There's the kind of hilarious bit where he's sort of born in the mud of the River Thames, and all these kind of people who make their living by, going through the mud, and they're all piping up, well, I think he should be called this.
Yeah. Indeed. I mean, yes, there's a reason, there's a story behind his name. I also need to tell you that this character, that is, of course, purely fictional, he is, but at the same time he's loosely based on an actual historical figure who was called George Smith. And I wanted to honor his life, and I wanted more people to know about him. So George Smith was born in the slum tenements of London, very poor, very disadvantaged upbringing, and I think he was a genius. And if he were alive today, we would have respected his mind. We would have recognized that he was somewhere on autism spectrum. He had an amazing visual memory. So without any privilege, any empowerment, this boy manages to decode the cuneiform. The cuneiform tablets that were brought from Nineveh, from the Middle East, which belonged to the time of King Ashurbanipal and before and after.
Who is also a character in the book.
Who is also a character in the book. Now, cuneiform, if you've seen a tablet closely, it's a very difficult script to read, especially at the time. And also we need to remember that lots of the tablets were broken and shattered. So he manages to decode the flood tablet, and in order to find the missing lines in the poem, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he comes to the Middle East twice, and he loses his life there, and he's buried there between Syria and Turkey in a small village. So I wanted to write about this. How does it work when someone becomes so passionate about a poem, just finding the missing lines in a poem? So that's one of my characters. My other character is Zeliha, who is the child of immigrants in the UK, and she's a water scientist. She's going through a very bumpy, very rough period in her life. Her marriage is coming to an end. And this is a woman who is interested in underground rivers or lost rivers, buried rivers. That's an important metaphor also in the book. I love studying buried rivers. London is a city of buried rivers. So is New York, so is Moscow, so is Athens, many, many parts of the world. And just because we buried them, it doesn't mean that they don't exist anymore. You know, they're still part of our lives. The third character is a Yazidi girl called Nareen. It wasn't easy to write this part of the book. The Yazidi genocide of 2014 happened in front of the eyes of the world, but not many people realize that this is one of the most vulnerable minorities in the world. They have gone through at least 72 massacres throughout their history. And it's a very vulnerable community in which memory is transmitted mostly through oral storytelling and songs. So she is also a big part of this book.
And her grandmother also
and
features.
Her grandmother.
And I just wonder, within those characters, and we know that writers reflect themselves in much of their work, is there one that you particularly identify with, or are you in all of them?
Really, I can't just say, one character or the other. I think I am in all of them. At the same time, I'm none of them. But I also find myself in the drop of water, in the trees, in the, there's a beautiful essay by Gustave Flaubert, a letter actually, in which he says, I'm the wind, I'm the horses, I'm the leaves, not only the characters, but everything you write about, you connect. You have to connect with them.
And of course, you've effectively been exiled from the land of the river Tigris to the land of the river Thames, both the rivers that feature here. But so, I mean, you talk about it as you talk about dismantling walls through the art of storytelling, and I guess you're really, really doing that in this book.
I hope so. It's something that's very, very close to my heart. I've always believed that that's the power of literature. It can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized. It can bring the periphery to the center. It can make the invisible a bit more visible. And it can also help us discuss difficult or challenging issues such as cultural collective memory, collective amnesia. Where are the untold stories, silent stories throughout history, but also cultural heritage? Whom does it belong to? Can we talk about all these issues, but in a calm and nuanced way?
Now, I believe that this was part of a 2-book deal. So what's the second?
I don't know yet, because I try not to immediately start the next book. Between books, I like to listen to the universe, what the universe is telling me. All I know is writing is really difficult. I mean, I'm a bit miserable like many authors when I'm writing. I'm much more miserable when I'm not writing, when I'm in between books. So inside the novel, I find joy also, I find beauty, I find freedom. That's where my heart beats, especially this genre with its broader canvas. The way it holds multiplicities, the way it gives us a sense of freedom is really close to my heart, but I don't immediately decide what the next book is going to be about.
And would you say that is it correct to say that your book has a tinge of magical realism?
I understand when people say this, but I really don't like that categorization much. What I'm doing is storytelling. Where do we draw these lines? I mean, life itself has magic, doesn't it? You can't write novels solely by relying on rationality. It has irrational components as well. I mean, I grew up, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was raised by a grandma who was a storyteller, and her house was full of superstitions, and, in her world, water spoke, mountains grumbled, trees murmured. That was all okay. So I think it's a very Western, very Eurocentric way of looking at the world, saying, okay, this is magic, this is realism. Whereas if you live in a city like Istanbul, everything is mingled all the time, not only in terms of magic and reality, but also East and West, sorrow and humor. There is melancholy in the funniest moments in Istanbul, or there is an element of perhaps humor in the saddest perhaps encounters. So it's a city that mixes everything constantly, and that's how life is.
You have a final note at the end of the book. This novel is the work of a junior scribe, one of the many bards, balladeers and storytellers who walk the earth. We weave poems, songs and stories out of every breath. May you remember us. Tell us about that.
Well, There's a tablet in the book found thousands and thousands of years ago. So I imagined a junior scribe in ancient Mesopotamia, just perhaps suffering but doing his work diligently and writing down the Epic of Gilgamesh, working and working really hard. Now, thousands of years later, here we are, novelists, storytellers, bards, balladeers. We're still working hard, doing our best. So yeah, I think stories give us a sense of meaning, a sense of continuity, help us to really, really empathize with our fellow human beings. In many ways, our age is the age of anxiety. But if it were to evolve into the age of apathy, I think it would be a much, much darker world. So we need stories in order not to fall into apathy, because apathy is when I stop caring about how you feel, when I stop, when I become completely disconnected, desensitized. And I think storytelling in many ways is the balm, is the antidote of our broken and fractured times.
And just finally, about people's reactions to your book, I know that you get lots of reactions, as you were talking about, from all over the world. I wonder how this book has landed.
Well, because it's not out yet. It's coming out in August. Not many people have read it yet. But those who have read, it's been, incredible to see the excitement, the passion. Also, I have readers from very, very diverse backgrounds, different age groups, different, cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. It's really makes my heart perhaps sore when I see people becoming friends when they're waiting in the book signing queue. Yeah, we share something that goes beyond borders. Really, really, literature connects us. When I say this, when I say books can save us, I really mean it, because it happened to me. So it's very precious for me to see the excitement coming from readers from very, very diverse backgrounds.
And just finally, before we go, as you said, you like to take a little bit of time after a book, let it settle, listen to people. But during that time, you're also talking to people, because you are a great orator, you are a great intellectual. We see you on our stages, on panels, on talking about really important issues. And I just wonder, obviously we've heard from you what drives you, but all of those different roles, you're taking on an enormous weight of responsibility.
I try to not to think in those terms. I think we need to be in the public space as women, as minorities. Our voices matter. Our stories matter. I want to see more women, public intellectuals, more working class public intellectuals, more public intellectuals from multiple backgrounds. There are important issues that we need to talk about, but let us create inclusive, more egalitarian, public spaces where each and every one of us feels welcome and treated equally with dignity. This to me is important. It's not an easy thing. I am an introvert by nature. I would have found it much easier to just remain in my room surrounded by books. That is my natural habitat. But I also believe that in this age, especially if we don't want to go towards apathy, we need to connect. We need to connect with three things, primarily with each other. Especially as women, we have to do global solidarity is important. Global sisterhood is so important. So let us connect. Let us not be, atomized individuals. Secondly, we need to connect with ourselves within. There's an inner journey. You may call it spiritual, but we have to connect with the inner garden. The garden inside. And the third thing we need to do is we have to connect with nature, environment, the ecosystems that we belong to. We are not above, the environment. We are not more clever than all other creatures in the world as we, presumed. And we are not, we have turned ourselves into consumers of nature. So we need to shatter that perception and connect with the environment in a much more humble way, if I may use this term. So connections are, I think, becoming very, very important in this very broken times.
Well, I think this book does all of that absolutely beautifully. It's called There Are Rivers in the Sky. It's published by Viking and it's out in August. And you can listen back to previous interviews with Elif on our website. I think it was episodes 309 and 182 of the show. And of course this one. Elif Shafak, thank you so much for coming to talk to me.
I'm very grateful. Thank you so much.
You've You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks very much to the producer, Tamsin Howard, and the engineer, Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes, including those with Elif, from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.